This presentation is about fiscal policy, which is the use of government spending and the level of taxation in the economy. So fiscal policy includes government spending and taxation, and of course the two are closely connected. We are going to look at fiscal policy in normal circumstances. That means when the economy is behaving reasonably normally. In these normal circumstances, the government is responsible for providing public goods. These are goods that cannot be provided by a market. Because of their characteristics, goods like street lighting and national defense can never be provided by a market to individual consumers. These public goods are indivisible, non-excludable, and non-rivalrous, which means that the government has to provide them through taxation. As well as public goods, the government also chooses to provide merit goods. The definition of merit goods is a little bit difficult. Merit goods can be provided by markets, but they tend to be goods which have positive externalities, that is to say, benefits to third parties who are not the producers and not the consumers. Also, they are goods that the government thinks we should have. They are things that the government thinks we should consume, such as public parks, open spaces, this kind of thing. The arts is another example of a merit good, something that the government thinks benefits the people. So things like opera, theatre, ballet. Some of this is financed by taxpayers' money. So these are merit goods. So what we can see that taxation is necessary for the provision of public goods and merit goods under normal circumstances. Taxes can be split into direct taxes, which are taxes on our income. Income tax is the obvious example, and households pay income tax directly from the money they earn. Then there are indirect taxes. These are taxes on money we spend. So VAT, value-added tax, which is added to the price of goods we buy, is an indirect tax. So we have established that government spending is necessary to provide public goods, and that the government also spends money under normal circumstances to provide merit goods. The finance for this spending comes from taxation, both direct and indirect. Now let's have a quick look at what the government tends to spend its money on. We've talked about public goods and merit goods. Let's break these down a little bit further. The government budget is the planned spending of the government in 1 year. And the main items in the UK government budget are healthcare, education, and social security payments. These three make up the biggest elements of government spending in the government budget. Other elements of spending include national defense, infrastructure, which is things like roads, railways, etc., and spending on the police and the legal system. So we can see the major items in the government budget. G is government desired spending, the desired spending by the government per year. T is expected tax revenue. As we have said, usually government spending is bigger than tax revenue. So what we usually have is called a budget deficit. When G is bigger than T, we say that there is a government budget deficit. This is financed or paid for by the selling of bonds to the commercial banks. In other words, the government borrows to finance its budget deficit. For example, let's put some numbers on this. If government spending in the UK is £700 billion a year, and tax revenues are £550 billion a year, then we have a government budget deficit of £150 billion. And this is the required amount of borrowing that the government will have to do. Now, the annual budget deficit, for example, this £150 billion that the government will have to borrow, The annual budget deficit increases the national debt. The national debt is the total amount the government owes since the beginning of history. So every time the government spends more than it earns in taxes, in other words, every year that it has a budget deficit, this deficit or borrowing increases the total amount that the government owes other people. And this is called the national debt, the total amount owed by the government. And this is equal to the total value of bonds that have been issued by the government and still not paid back. So the UK national debt in 2015 is actually greater than £1 trillion, and it's still growing, because every year the government still has a budget deficit. So how can governments keep borrowing money like this? Well, the most important thing that allows governments to keep borrowing is that the economy must be growing. If the economy is growing, if GDP is growing, tax revenues will also be increasing year by year. And knowing this, banks are happy to lend to governments. So this is one big reason why governments can continue to borrow money. So therefore, what we learn is that the government borrowing ability, its ability to borrow money, depends largely on continued economic growth. Economic growth is the thing that underpins or ties government borrowing together and allows the government to keep borrowing money year after year. This is why the 2007 financial crisis was so serious. Because not only did it require governments to borrow a lot more money so that they could bail out the banks by buying shares in them, but the financial crisis also led to a huge recession, which lasted from 2009 to 2011. So at the same time that governments were borrowing more money, economic growth was negative. So this is the worst of all possible scenarios. Higher government borrowing plus lower or negative economic growth. Somehow, the UK government, with international cooperation, was able to get through this period and is still able to sell its bonds and still able to borrow money, even though our national debt is growing. So we can see quite clearly that the budget deficit, the difference between government spending and taxation, is influenced by economic shocks, such as the bankruptcy of banks in 2007-2008. But the interesting thing is that the budget deficit is also largely affected by the economic cycle. We know that economies go up and down in terms of their real GDP. The down phase is called recession. When an economy is in recession, the budget deficit automatically grows, because in recession, household incomes are falling and tax revenues to the government are falling. But government spending on things like welfare payments increases. So the gap between G and T gets larger during a recession. The opposite happens when the economy is in a growth phase. Here, government spending on welfare payments falls and tax revenues increase. So the gap between G and T falls, narrows. So this is the situation with the budget deficit. In a recession, the deficit increases. In a growth phase, the deficit falls. And this is completely normal. What we see here, in fact, is what's called a fiscal stabilizer. When the GDP of a country is growing, households have to pay more tax, and so do firms. This takes away some of their income and stops them spending it, which means that the GDP grows more slowly. So when GDP grows, this is a fiscal drag. It stops the GDP from growing too quickly, because the more we earn, the more the government takes away in tax. On the other hand, when the GDP is falling, government spending on social security payments, welfare payments, goes up. And so the unemployed don't have zero income, but they receive some money in payments from the government. And this means that they can continue to spend money and that GDP doesn't fall too quickly. So when GDP is rising, there are forces to stop it rising too quickly. When GDP is falling, there are fiscal forces to stop it falling too quickly. Hence, we call it a fiscal stabilizer. So what we can see is that in normal circumstances, the government spends money to provide public goods and merit goods. We can see that the budget deficit goes up and down regularly with the economic cycle. It rises during recessions and falls during periods of growth. And the budget deficit can continue year after year as long as GDP is following a rising trend. So the banks are happy to lend to the government as long as they can see that over time the trend in the GDP is up. As long as they can see that, they don't mind buying government bonds because they know that over time the government is receiving more tax revenue. So as long as the budget deficit stays at a reliable percentage of GDP, things are relatively stable, and governments feel relatively comfortable, and banks feel relatively comfortable to lend money to governments. So we don't really worry about the budget deficit as long as it stays within a reliably tolerable percentage of GDP. So as long as this number, the budget deficit, doesn't become too big historically compared to the level of GDP, we are comfortable. So we have looked at a few elements of government spending, and we have seen that when government spending cannot be financed by taxation, it is financed by borrowing, and that in normal circumstances, this is normal. The government usually spends more than it gets from taxation, and that the deficit that the government has every year has come to be seen as normal, as long as the deficit is within a reasonably low percentage of total GDP.